The heavy rains and thunderstorms we've had this year have brought flooding and road damage, and they've also created conditions for more pollution runoff. Jeff Schloss is with the Lake Champlain Sea Grant.
We could be looking at 90 to 120% of what the yearly input of nutrients would have normally been in a given year, just in the 2 or 3 days that it rained for the floods.
And that means more dangerous algae blooms. How to stay safe on today's Story of the Day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Clarkson University, offering over 95 programs of study with campuses in the Hudson Valley, Central, and Northern New York. More at clarkson.edu.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Friday, August 18th. First up, a museum and science center in Rochester is repatriating indigenous remains that had been part of its collection. The Rochester Museum and Science Center held a ceremony where the Oneida Nation reclaimed the human remains, and museum officials apologized for contributing to a practice that dehumanizes Native Americans. WXXI's Noelle Evans reports.
We're in the Cunningham House outside the Rochester Museum and Science Center. Draped over a table at the front of the room is a wool blanket depicting the clans and nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. On it rests 19 tiny leather pouches. These are medicine bags. Oneida Representative Ray Holbritter says each one represents a person whose remains will be properly buried after having been exhumed and put on display.
These bags are traditionally made when preparing for a significant journey. These bags will accompany our ancestors on a final journey as their remains will be returned to our homelands until the end of time. That's where they will rest.
Holbritter has just finished signing an official document transferring the remains and artifacts to the Oneida Indian Nation through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The law was first enacted in 1990.
I want to acknowledge that this repatriation should have occurred a long time ago, and to recognize that the ancestors and their belongings should never have been at the RMSC in the first place.
That's the museum's CEO, Hillary Olson. She says the organization has shifted priorities the past 2 years to focus on repatriating indigenous remains and artifacts. According to a report by ProPublica earlier this year, RMSC has the 21st largest collection of unrepatriated indigenous remains in the United States. Catherine Morano-Santos with the museum says that's already changing.
We know that there's a lot more work to be done, and in fact, we are working in concert with the tribes and nations now, following their lead and moving forward with their priorities to complete our repatriation work.
Santos says RMSC is working with about 20 tribes and nations across New York State on those efforts. The Oneida have been among them. Ray Holbritter says this ceremony to return the remains of Oneida people to their homeland bears great significance, especially at a time when there are still over 100,000 unrepatriated Native American remains at museums and institutions across the country.
Above all, it must be understood that every minute the remains of our ancestors and our cultural artifacts are not returned continues this shameful legacy of abuse inflicted upon Native peoples.
In Rochester, I'm Noelle Evans for North Country Public Radio.
Harmful algal blooms are a recurring issue in water bodies across the North Country and Vermont. High phosphorus levels caused by runoff from farms, yards, and roads feed the blooms of cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae. And this year's powerful storms mean more runoff. Jeff Schloss of the Lake Champlain Sea Grant told Champlain Valley reporter Kara Chapman that's a big concern for the rest of the summer and a long-term problem. That's because it adds up to what's called legacy phosphorus in the lake.
Even though that material might go down to the bottom, the way phosphorus works, it attaches very readily when there's oxygen in the water. But when it gets to the deeper parts of the lake, which during the summer, sometimes we lose oxygen as you get closer to the bottom, as the summer progresses. When you lose oxygen, it tends to allow the phosphorus to be released from the sediments. That's what we call legacy phosphorus.
Mm-hmm. And can you describe, what a bloom of these organisms looks like and where they tend to occur in the lake? And do they tend to look pretty obvious when they're there?
Yes, they're very obvious when they're there. When they come up to the surface, at various times of the year. We generally see them as scums or what would look like green masses with small, tiny pin-sized little round globes, or we see them looking like spilled paint on the water. Sometimes we see them a little bit more deeper in the water column as well as the surface, and they look like flakes, small, tiny flakes as you look down into the water. On occasion, they essentially come up to the surface, and there's either enough of them to create in a large congregation what we call a bloom, or sometimes they might just come up all over the lake, but because of the winds, prevailing winds, they get blown into the embayments and the bays and the shoreline areas and collect. And that's when we get most concerned, because it's when we have a bloom condition that we are very concerned about the cyanobacteria, because they do and have been known to produce toxins.
Can you talk a bit more about those toxins? What are the side effects people should look out for when they've been exposed or when their pets have been exposed?
The one side effect that they would experience that's the least problematic is there are many people who are allergic to them just by being in the water with them, and it's not uncommon for rashes or hives or other types of things to appear because of just contact. But what we're really concerned about even more is that they're known to produce different types of toxins that include liver toxins and neurotoxins. And the real concern is not just a single exposure, but exposure around blooms. When the wind blows on these blooms, they create aerosols, which then suspend some of these very small cells into the air, and so there can be exposure that way. So it can be very problematic, especially for dogs, which are typically attracted to the smell and drink water. Dogs have been known to pass away right away, either through liver or neurological disorders, and it's especially dangerous for small children.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't really know that it can aerosolize, because they tell you don't go in the water, not necessarily near the water, I feel, unless I just haven't been listening properly.
No, that is true. There are, we've done a number of studies here in Vermont as well as New Hampshire, which have shown that we could actually detect not just the toxins, but also the cells in aerosols. And that could be one way of transmitting those toxins. And that's the real concern, is that you might swim in a bloom and feel like you've come out unscathed. But unfortunately, there are also some chronic effects that to occur, neurological disorders and things like that we would be concerned about with repeated exposures.
Jeff, is there anything that people can do to help prevent blooms from happening, or at least to, stem the flow of phosphorus into the lake?
When we have storms, what we really want to do is make sure that the stormwater isn't taking more nutrients down into the lake by doing different types of practices. That could include installing rain barrels, for example, to capture the water so it doesn't run off right away, and you can slowly use that to water your lawns. Keeping our grass cut high so that they form a barrier. Remember, anything you put in the way of runoff, especially vegetative things like grasses and shrubs and trees and things, the more vegetation we can throw in the way of stormwater, the better. And we do that by installing rain gardens and putting down various buffers on properties, and also promote working with different types of river associations and friends of rivers that work a lot to try to do plantings in some of the more vulnerable banks so that they don't get eroded. There's more protection, because the more we can keep the soils and the sediments on land and not in the lake, the less legacy phosphorus we're going to have to work with.
That was Jeff Schloss with the Lake Champlain Sea Grant Program speaking with Champlain Valley reporter Kara Chapman about harmful algal blooms in Lake Champlain. State and local authorities will post signage if a beach is closed due to a bloom. And you can also check water conditions before you go. We have more information on our website, ncpr.org. More news all the time and through the weekend on that website, ncpr.org. Music today by Eddie Lawrence of Moira and Ramon Vasquez and Michael Hart of Malone, all Franklin County, all the time. Have a great weekend. I'm David Summerstein, North Country Public Radio.